I'll kick it off with a karakia, and then I'll hand it over to Brian. Tui ka runa, tui ka raro, tui ka roto, tui ka waho, tui ki te hea tangata, ka rongo te po, ka rongo te ao, homie hui tākia. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Brian Yee. Brian and I crossed paths a little bit in basketball days, but he's got some really good ideas about thinking differently, which is probably very important for sports at the moment. So without further ado, welcome, Brian, and thank you very much for doing this.
Okay, thank you, Matt, for inviting us to share some thoughts. So I think the point of the talk today, or the presentation, is obviously talk about strategy in the context of the sporting industry. So hopefully I can share some ideas that you can take away, and as I go through this presentation, if you have any questions or any making comments, if you can drop them into the chat, and I think Matt's going to help me maybe interject and ask some questions, etc., if you want to. But otherwise, just leave them at the end. There'll be opportunity to talk about to answer some questions at the end. But just a little bit of background. So I'm from an organisation, it's called MSH, which is a strategy consulting company. So some of the observations and ideas that I share today is probably just through some experiences that we have working with sports organisations over the time. So hopefully they're relevant to you, and you see some of the challenges that I'm going to talk about today. If you can take away just a few of the ideas that I float today, that'd be fantastic. So just to give a bit of background in terms of some of the work that we've done in the sports industry. I think I crossed paths with Matt because I was on the board of BBNZ for 8 years. I was the chair for the last couple. So clearly, developing strategies and embedding it and getting it to work in BBNZ was a key focus of the board, working with management. Excuse me, I'm just going to admit some more people. And we have done work around the country with sports organisations. So just a bit of context, we did some work around sports Taranaki, sports Otago, New Zealand yachting, and even small organisations like New Zealand Pony Association. So some of the ideas are sort of drawn from my experiences through that. And obviously, a lot of the challenges that you have in this as a sports organisations is fundamentally different from a big corporation or a big organisation. So that's the purpose of today is to look at the distinction between the two and why, what is the smarter game plan for getting strategies to work in a sporting environment. Okay. So I think the key point I just wanted to share is obviously we've been around for a long time, 25 years, and thinking about strategy and how do you develop strategy for a sports organisation. It's probably fair to say that the approach that you would adopt for a sports organisation should be or is fundamentally different. Because if you think about, most organisations that you may have worked for that's not a sports organisation, they typically, look at it from a long-term perspective, looking out 3 to 5 years, and they're fundamentally looking at, what do we need to do now to intercept the future? What do we need to invest in now? What changes do we need to put in place? Looking at the strategy across different entities, etc. And that approach is like what we would call a traditional strategy approach, and it's a lot of entities have different methods to do that, but that's essentially, long-term vision goals over long periods of time and fundamentally looking at what do we need to do now and invest in now in order to, create deliver on our vision and goals. But I guess the challenge, and it's interesting to hear any viewpoints, and it's based on my experience, is that most boards, they do want to do strategy, they do want to implement an approach. But in our view, based on my experiences, a traditional strategy approach, it won't work. And the main reason it doesn't work is most sports organisations, particularly ones that I've been involved in, and the ones that I've talked to as well, they don't typically have the people, the disciplines, and particularly the money in order to focus on what we call the critical change aspects of strategy, as well as delivering what we call the game for New Zealanders, i.e. doing business as usual. So most organisations that we've worked with, they're really good at focusing on the here and now, the business as usual, the priorities of today. But really, do they have the capacity to really think about fundamental strategic change in their organisation? So I think the slide here is really just, I mean, obviously most of you would be aligned to Sports New Zealand in terms of their governance practices. But based on, when I was at BBNZ, obviously we dealt with Sports NZ, and they talk about what makes good governance when it comes to, governing a sports organisation. But the key point about governance is one of the key critical principles of that is that the board, in partnership with management, sets the strategic direction for the organisation. So clearly, there's always a bit of a dispute if you're in a sports organisation. Whose fundamental role is it? Is it the responsibility of the board? Is it the fundamental role of the organisation or the leadership team to do that? But the fundamental principle is you set it together, in partnership with each other. But obviously, manager has the knowledge and the ability to be able to design sort of the operational methods and means to achieve it. So it's not either or. It's how do you work in partnership with each other, and so that's one of the critical principles around strategy for sports organisations, which most of you would be familiar with. But this slide here is just talking about from our perspective, and it's trying to give you a perspective about where a board, if you think about governance and think about a board, where they spend most of their time. And it sort of breaks it down. If you think about the quadrants, it talks about on the top, it talks about conformance and performance. And then on the bottom, it talks about, the focus areas. So
I can't see your screen at the moment. Sorry.
Oh, is it dropped off?
Yeah.
Is it there? I see Paul putting his thumb up. Are you not?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. Totally good.
Are you all right there, Matt?
No, I can't see it, but carry
on. Okay. Let me talk. If everyone else can see it, I'll just carry on talking. I'm going to send this presentation out at the end of this presentation, Matt. But the matrix is basically just trying to cut up a board's role when it comes to governance. And if you think about the matrix, strategic thinking is all about it's about the long-term focus on performance, but from an internal perspective. And then you've got those different quadrants. But from our observations and our view, we believe that most boards don't spend enough time in the strategic thinking box. So that's the one that's about deciding on the strategic direction, the goals, the plans. And the last point's probably quite relevant. How do I continuously review and decide major resource decisions and investments in order to deliver on our strategy? So those numbers and red is probably sort of what we observe, that a lot of the time is spent on the supervision box. A lot of the time is around accountability and policy formation, etc. But not enough time is spent on strategic thinking from the point of view of the board. And we believe it should be closer from not so much 15, but it should be more around 30%. So roughly a 30% of the time the board should be working with management to think about, strategy and how do we, make it happen, etc. So the next slide here is just saying, well, why do boards typically spend a lack of time in strategy? And this matrix here is just a different way of giving a better understanding of why is that the case. And it is a framework around, well, in order to get strategy to work, you've got to have really good engagement between a board and the management team. So, for example, if there's high engagement with the board, but a management team has got low engagement when it comes to strategy, is what we call governance by fear, and then there's obviously the different categories of where there's high engagement by the executive team or management, but there's low engagement by our board, which probably rarely happens, less of. That's where typically the managers are the governors as opposed to the board. But the ideal optimal situation is the intercept between where there's high board engagement and high executive team engagement. So that's where you get the partnership thing. So in order to work through optimal governance, the question is, how do we get boards and the executive team to lift their focus and engage in those strategic conversations? So this is the whole point about strategy. How do you create a strategy that allows you to do that, which is really the focus of this talk. The next slide here is just talking about, well, it's fine about developing strategies and trying to have conversations, but even if you have a collaborative approach and you're on the same page about how do you develop strategies, I think the fundamental challenge for most sports organisations, particularly the ones that we've been working with, is sports organisations do not have discretionary funding to invest in long-term development of the game. So that obviously the development of the outcomes you're trying to deliver on, and that most organisations, even when I was in BB&Z, they operated what we would say on the back of somewhat of an oily rag. There's not a lot of discretionary funding, there's not a lot of money, it's all committed, etc. And I think that's the fundamental challenge. How do you actually be strategic when there's bugger all money to invest in the game? So I guess the consequences of that, and it's really, I guess when you're on a board or you're part of management, is how relevant is the strategy? And if a lot of strategies as we see created in sports organisations, but obviously in organisations as well, if you don't invest in it, they pretty much become irrelevant. They're just left on the shelf, really. So obviously funding is a major issue about how do you have a relevant strategy in your organisation. So our view around, what could you do in order to bridge the gap? How do you actually make strategies real? And I think there is, that is the key challenge with a board and a management team, is how do you bridge the gap between the strategy and the operations? Because clearly working in partnership, you're trying to make it work or make it happen. So I guess the heart of this conversation is really around there are three ideas that we would just wanted to put up today and just discuss with you today. Just based on our experiences about, well, how do you bridge that gap? How do you make strategy relevant for a sports organisation that has limited capacity when it comes to discretionary money or resources to be able to do that? And it's all about trying to build long-term value through strategic change, given strategy is about change, isn't it, in order to deliver on long-term outcomes. So just a few. So I just want to talk about a few ideas. So the first idea that we have is really, if I'm trying to get more focus on a strategy, one of the critical things is making sure that you focus on a tight set of strategic priorities. So I don't know if most of you have experienced that when people go develop strategies, they tend to come up with these lofty 3 to 5 year aspirational goals and all that. They sit out there, they're really lofty and they don't quite mean too much. But this is one technique that when we work with people, we say, well, if you can map your strategy onto a single page, and make sure that there are clear linkages between the different parts of your business, then you've got a better chance of being able to focus on your strategic priorities. So I don't know if you've heard about the notion of the strategy mapping's been around for a long time. It's based on what we call the balanced scorecard. So if you look at that diagram on the right, there's 4. Clearly you have a vision at the top of your organisation. But if you're trying to create a good strategy, you've got to be make sure that you think about 4 perspectives of your organisation. So one is about the ownership perspective. So it's ownership slash it could be financial or non-financial outcomes. Always thinking about the customer and the value you're trying to deliver to that customer. The processes is obviously strategic or fundamentally what are the, how do we operate in order to deliver to the customer? And at the bottom, the 4th perspective is what they call the learning and growth perspective. So this is where you invest in things like people, information, infrastructure. So the challenge for any organisation, including sports organisations, is what I need to invest in order to improve my business processes to deliver to my customers to achieve great outcomes. And the opportunity for sports organisations, if you can get clarity around those linkages, then I think you've got better chance of basically understanding where your priorities fit. You could say, one of our key priorities is to improve our people capability in this area of the business to improve the offering to achieve those outcomes. And I think just being able to get that clarity around where our strategic priorities is probably one of the things that a sports organisation can do in order to work out how do you actually make your strategy, real to your organisation. So that's the first sort of thought around creating relevant strategies. The second one is around, I talked about, strategies about how do you intercept the future, how do you invest in change in order to deliver on your vision and goals right at the beginning. I mean, that's a traditional approach. But like I sort of, what we see in many organizations, which are a lot more, which are bigger than, most sports organizations, what they tend to do is, they have a strategy and they'll have a small set of change initiatives that are completed over multiple years. And it often requires, big project teams to work together to deliver on that change over extended periods of time. Our fundamental view is applying this approach in sports organizations typically results in a lot of projects never getting off the ground. So we see, sports organizations really have been quite ambitious. We want to do these 5 fundamental transformational projects, but because they're so big and grand and all that, and there's a lack of resourcing, it's hard to it's hard to be able to implement those big bang change initiatives. So what we would suggest for a sports organisation is a different approach. So a better approach is to come up with sort of incremental changes, each year. That's in the direction, but it moves the organisation forward to the desired state. So you think about the difference, do I have 5 or 6 transformational projects that I'm going to deliver in the 3 or 5 years' time? Or given that we know where we're trying to move to, what are the fundamental shifts that we want to make this year and really focus on those? So it's a different mindset, it's a different perspective. So we would encourage sports organizations to not be too big and lofty and think about transformational, things too much, but think about what I want to achieve this year in terms of incremental change. And the last bullet point on the page is really, you can do that, but you want to make sure that your change that you're investing in your business is balanced. So there is a notion of making sure that your initiatives to move your organization forward should fit into sort of these 3 categories around the page. So obviously stay in the race, win the race, and obviously fundamentally change the rules. So most organization strategies will focus on the last one. For sports organizations, you want to have a balance of the few. I mean, big organizations would do the other 2 categories, but it's not on their strategy. But I think it's important to just think about it, incrementally, what are the changes that we're going to make in these 3 categories. So that's really the second idea, really, is just design change initiatives around how your business actually works along these three categories. And the last idea that we had, and we've sort of floated around a lot, is, when we work with sports organisations a lot, you create these strategies, they go, oh, this is wonderful, it's aspirational. We love the vision, we love the goals and all that. But then there's a but we don't have any resources to invest in any of this change. And most sports organisations were saying that, and we've committed, we have to deliver business as usual to our organisations. But we would tend to push back on that. And I think even though there's no new money, I think we would always say, from a board and management's perspective, I think the point is that you should always view your resources as discretionary. You obviously look at your resources discretionary and non-discretionary. But I think the point is that you want to push the boundaries, those boundaries between the two. Because even in the BB&Z example, when I was at BB&Z, they would say 90% of our resources are non-discretionary. So therefore, you can't actually move money around. But I think the challenge for most boards and management team is to challenge yourself and really push those boundaries. Otherwise, you're not going to do anything with strategy. It becomes, particularly if there's no new money, like Sports New Zealand's not going to give you any new money, etc. You're required to deliver your vision and goals within your current funding package. So the fundamental point here is really, in our view, everything is discretionary in the context of strategy. So open your mind to that. We could do things differently all the time, and we could stop. We can. But the important thing is to continuously think about how do we align the resources, i.e., your budgets and your people, to sort of the key results. And you can always, and it's not either or. You can scale up and you can scale down. But this table here is like deciding what activities to stop is equally as important. Is equally as important as deciding what new initiatives to invest in. So I think it's not either or. I think if you think about, these categories on this table, you think about things I can start, things I could do more of, things I could do less of, and things I can stop. And I think it's those middle two categories that people don't really think about, because most management teams and boards will think about A or B. So I can start this or I can stop that, and it's more like a bit of a ultimatum. If you want us to focus on that, we're going to stop that. But the opportunity really is to think more laterally around those four categories, particularly what I can do more of and what I can do less of. Yeah. And there's only a couple more slides, and then so the fundamental point is obviously when it comes to development strategy for sports organisations, the heading is obviously saying a short-term version of the strategy game will set you up for victory. So essentially, strategy is important. You got to have it to create your vision. The board and the management team must see eye to eye about the direction. But at the end of the day, you're all playing the same strategy game. You're working in partnership. But our view is don't take the traditional strategy approach, which is the big bang, invest in change over long periods of time, but take a more of an incremental approach in order to move your organisation forward. And obviously the how to do that is those three areas, which is essentially be clear about your priorities, think about where your discretionary resources can be, and the other one was essentially the designing the change initiatives so that it's more short-term than long-term. Yeah. So that was really all I wanted to share with you today. Hopefully it sort of made sense. It wasn't too quick. There's a bit of material there, but I am going to send it to Matt. He's going to send it out to you. But maybe if anyone had any questions or comments that people would like to make, or even to say, hey, some of the observations you've shared, we can relate to, or some of the observations you share we don't agree with. Happy to take those, have those conversations. So Matt, I don't know if there was any questions that popped up, or I don't even know if you saw the presentation, mate, but everyone else did. Hopefully they did. So
There's no questions in the chat, but if anybody has questions they want to ask verbally, happy to take them.
I wanted to present something, if that's okay, Brian.
yep,
You've framed your very good comments around lack of resources, i.e. money. I attended a really good webinar last week run by Volunteering New Zealand that asked the question, if you had all the money in the world, would you still use volunteers? And everybody said yes. So my point is, rather than thinking it's a money issue in terms of strategy, it's about, in my view, a human resource issue. And most sports organisations I've been involved with pick up their governors from ex-players, or somebody screwed somebody's arm up. They don't strategically go out and recruit people for their governance that will fill the gap that's needed. So just wondered whether you got any thoughts around that.
Yeah, Roger. No, it's a good question, Roger. It's a couple of thoughts. When I talked about the lack of, ability to make strategy work, and it's about lack of investment of money. What it is, when we talk about money, we talk about resources. So clearly, in order to invest in change and make change happen, you've got to divert a lot of your resources to make the change happen. So we are talking about money investment, but we're talking about people investment. Obviously, when it comes to the sports industry, the volunteers is a critical resource. So if you can't motivate a voluntary army to come along and work with you, you are going to lack the ability to transform your industry in a strategic sense. So and I think your second comment, Roger, was around, you are like most sports organisations, the governors are volunteers. Is that the point you're making?
Yeah.
And obviously there are Sports New Zealand have good processes about ensuring that they get the good volunteers in place, and obviously the top-notch sporting entities, they're in the categories like netball and rugby. They pay their boards, but BB&Z and some of the others, smaller entities, they are essentially reliant on good volunteer governors. And I think there's always going to be a challenge about how do you attract good volunteers. But I think everybody's in the same boat. They volunteer their time and their expertise and knowledge because they're passionate about the sport. I mean, that's common with every sport, isn't it? And I don't think that will change. I think everybody wants to give back, but be part of a community that they are passionate about. So, yeah.
I suppose my issue is you don't have to have been a basketball player to govern basketball. And I think a lot of sports are quite closed-minded, that the people they recruit for their governance need to be ex-players or ex-competitors of some sort, whereas I don't think that's needed at all. And when you look at across the not-for-profit sector, and I'm not saying they're perfect by any means, they don't have players or ex-players, so they recruit people from a wider spectrum than what sport tends to recruit them from. So sport recruits, operational volunteers for their boards, whereas I think the not-for-profits tend to recruit more strategic governors. It's not as black and white as that, but it's just
no, it's not. It's and it's a good point. I mean, my experience on BB&Z, we have good criteria about what do you need to bring to the table. So it's not just you had to be a basketball playing experience in the game, etc., to be on the board, but the expectations of the community is typically, why is this person on the board? Because they know nothing about the game. They've never, so depending on who you talk to, you'll get different viewpoints. But I think Sports New Zealand and many organisations will ensure there is different competencies that are brought to the table, but obviously connections to the game is one important aspect, but not the important aspect. So hopefully most organisations are similar to what BB&Z were doing in that regard. I think they are, because it's driven by Sport New Zealand.
We have had one question come in from Kendra. You touched on the volunteer things, and you may well have answered the question. With sports clubs struggling with numbers of volunteers to run operations, how do you suggest strategic plans to be implemented with resource challenges? I hope that makes sense.
How do you, given the lack of volunteers and resources, how do you implement? Well, that's the fundamental point around the strategy. I guess it's the level of ambition. If you can motivate a volunteer army to commit time and be part of the organisation and be part of the resource pool, you can be more ambitious in terms of your aspirations. So when I talked about the strategy, think about the incremental results you want to achieve that year. I think you got to make sure that you set your ambitions aligned to the level of resources that you can commit to. And that's a really important part of getting a strategy to work in a sports organisation. One of the things that we did do when we worked with, and it's a small organisation that may be relevant, New Zealand Pony Association, the challenge that they had was, hey, I'm sitting on the board and I'm trying to govern the organisation, move the organisation forward, but I'm also on all the committees, all our members are sitting on all the committees, and we're turning up to the events and we're running the pony shows on the day, etc., and all that, and so the fundamental point there was you have people that are committing as governors, and then they're also on the day-to-day committing their time running events and all that. And I don't think that's unusual for any sports organisation, because the availability of great people who volunteer their time, who are passionate, is fair and far between, and once you get them, you hang on to them. So the piece of advice that we gave to them was, no, it's not either or. You don't say if you're on the board, you don't do committee work or vice versa. It's just recognizing that you're wearing two different hats when you're actually committing your time. On one hand, I'm a governor and I'm committing my time on the board. And so let's commit your expertise there. And then when you're on a committee, you're on a different hat. So it's not a conflict of interest is what they were seeing it as. It's just saying that you've got limited volunteers and you want to make sure that you utilise the expertise of them. So it was just being clear about what hat you were wearing on as a volunteer when you are, committing all your valuable time to it. And that was a mindset shift rather than, they were trying to say it's, it should happen type thing, and how do we resolve it? But it's not. It's, even in my experience in, BB&Z and type stuff, you're on the board on that, but people getting involved in the, in the game, as long as it's not, it's clear about what you're doing. So, yeah.
Roger's written a little note here. I find it useful to use the terms policy volunteers and operational volunteers. People's motivations are different and many are happy to assist in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Matt, what was the categories that Roger talked about? Or
policy volunteers and operational volunteers.
Are they, is that trying to distinguish the different types of volunteers, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's important. I agree with what you just talked about with hats. A lot of people go onto boards and they're wearing the inappropriate hat in the board situation. I think it's really fundamental to understand what you're doing at this particular time and what hat am I wearing.
Yeah. And the other important hat when you're talking about sports, because clearly I think you have the notion of elected as well as appointed, don't you?
Yeah.
And obviously the challenges can be when it comes to elected, what hat you're wearing. Am I wearing a regional hat or am I wearing a national hat? So clearly the view is when you come into a national organisation, and you're representing a region, you obviously wearing our national needs, aren't you? And that's always the challenge, isn't it? And making sure you can lift yourself and come into the room with what we call the you come in with an independent view. So yeah.
Excellent. Has anybody else got any other questions I'd like to throw to Brian? Well, I'll take that as everybody is satisfied and happy with the presentation. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Brian. Very much appreciated this. We will also be putting this presentation up onto our website at some stage once we edit it and tidy it up a little bit. So it's available to be seen again at some point, because I think there was some really good thinking in there, and sometimes it needs to be revisited just to make sure you've got everything right. But appreciate your attendance. Any questions that you've had would be fantastic. If you want to send it through later, I can always forward them on to Brian. I also will send out a post webinar survey as well at some point in the next day or so. Thank you for your attendance, and Brian, once again, appreciate your time and thank you very much.
I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much for coming to listen, and thank you for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.